In 1324, one man walked across an entire continent and gave away so much gold that he accidentally crashed a country's economy for over a decade. By most modern estimates, he remains the richest individual in recorded human history, wealthier, adjusted for the modern world, than any billionaire alive today, and yet most people have never heard his name. This is the story of Mansa Musa, ruler of the Mali Empire, and the West African Islamic civilization that made him possible. If stories like this interest you, consider subscribing. It genuinely helps this channel keep making them. To understand Mansa Musa, you first have to understand the empire he inherited. The Mali Empire rose to power in West Africa in the 13th century, founded by Sundiata Keita, following a period of political fragmentation in the region. By the time Musa took the throne in 1312, Mali had already grown into one of the largest and wealthiest empires in the world, controlling vast stretches of West Africa and, crucially, major trade routes across the Sahara. Mali's wealth was built on a genuinely rare combination. It controlled access to some of the richest gold deposits known at the time, particularly from the Bambouk and Bura goldfields, and it sat astride the trans-Saharan trade routes connecting West Africa to North Africa, the Middle East, and by extension, Europe and Asia. Salt, copper, and enslaved people also moved through these networks. But gold was the empire's defining resource at a time when West African gold production is estimated to have accounted for a substantial share of the entire world's gold supply. Islam had entered the region gradually, over previous centuries through trade contact with North African Muslim merchants, and by Musa's reign, it was well established among Mali's ruling class and merchant communities, blending with existing West African political and cultural traditions rather than replacing them outright. In 1324, Mansa Musa set out on Hajj, the Islamic pilgrimage to Mecca. Religious obligation for Muslims who are able to undertake it. For a ruler of Musa's wealth and stature, this wasn't a modest journey. Historical accounts, though they vary somewhat in specific numbers, consistently describe an enormous caravan. Estimates range from thousands to as many as 60,000 people, including soldiers, officials, enslaved attendants, and camel drivers, along with a massive supply of gold carried specifically to fund the journey and be distributed along the way. Some accounts describe dozens of camels loaded purely with gold. As the caravan moved north through the Sahara and into Egypt, Musa reportedly gave away gold generously to the poor in every city he passed through, and made lavish purchases in local markets. When he reached Cairo, then one of the wealthiest and most important cities in the Islamic world, the scale of his generosity became a serious problem, not just a generous gesture. According to accounts written by contemporary Cairo-based historians, Musa's gold spending was so extensive that it caused a rapid devaluation of gold's value throughout Cairo's economy. Prices for goods spiked dramatically, and by some later accounts, it took over a decade for gold's value in the region to fully stabilize again. This detail alone is what has made Musa's story so widely circulated in modern retellings. A single man's generosity was significant, enough to visibly disrupt an entire regional economy. Musa completed his pilgrimage in Mecca, fulfilling his religious obligation, before beginning the long journey back to Mali. On the return journey, accounts suggest he had to borrow gold at high interest from Cairo's merchants after depleting so much of his own supply, a detail that adds a somewhat humbling coda to the story of history's wealthiest man. The pilgrimage's impact on Mali extended well beyond gold and reputation. On his return journey, Musa brought back scholars, architects, and religious teachers from across the Islamic world, most notably an Andalusian architect and poet known as Abu Ishaq al-Sahili, who is widely credited with helping to introduce new architectural styles to Mali, using distinctive fired brick building techniques in the construction of mosques and royal buildings. Under Musa's patronage, the city of Timbuktu, already an established trading center, transformed into one of the major intellectual and religious centers of the Islamic world. The Sankor Mosque, built during this period, became the anchor of what would develop into a significant center of learning, eventually housing what is now believed to have been one of the largest collections of manuscripts in West African history, covering subjects ranging from law and theology to astronomy and mathematics. Timbuktu's reputation as a center of scholarship grew substantially in the decades following Musa's reign, drawing students and scholars from across West Africa and the wider Islamic world, and its manuscript tradition remains, to this day, one of the most significant and still being studied archives of African intellectual history. Musa's pilgrimage had another lasting effect. It put Mali directly on the map of the wider world, in some cases quite literally. News of his wealth spread through Cairo and the broader Mediterranean trade networks, eventually reaching European mapmakers. The most famous example is the Catalan Atlas, produced in 1375 by Majorcan cartographers, which depicts a seated West African king holding a golden orb and scepter, labeled as the ruler of Mali, widely believed to represent Mansa Musa or the reputation he'd established. For roughly the next 2 centuries, European maps and accounts of West Africa continued to reference Mali's legendary wealth, often citing Musa's pilgrimage specifically as evidence of the region's riches, at a time when direct European contact with West Africa remained extremely limited. This is a genuinely significant historical point. Centuries before the era of European exploration and eventual colonization of Africa, West Africa was already known to European elites primarily as a place of extraordinary wealth and sophisticated civilization, a framing that stands in sharp contrast to the narratives that would later dominate European accounts of the continent during the colonial period. Mansa Musa died around 1337, and while later, Mali rulers continued governing a powerful state for generations afterward, the empire gradually declined over the following 2 centuries, facing internal succession disputes and growing regional competition, eventually giving way to the rise of the neighboring Songhai Empire by the late 15th century. But the intellectual and cultural infrastructure Musa had helped establish, particularly in Timbuktu, endured well beyond Mali's own political decline. Timbuktu remained a significant center of Islamic scholarship for centuries afterward, and many of its manuscripts survive today, having been preserved by local families and institutions through generations of political change, including through efforts to protect them during more recent conflicts in the region. Mansa Musa's story challenges a framing that too often goes unquestioned. That West Africa's history begins with European contact. Centuries before that, Mali stood as one of the wealthiest, most sophisticated empires on earth, home to a ruler whose pilgrimage was significant enough to shift gold markets across an entire region and place his kingdom on maps drawn continents away. His story is a reminder that the full picture of Islamic civilization and of world history more broadly is far larger and more geographically diverse than the handful of regions most commonly covered. West Africa's Islamic empires deserve to be part of that story too.